Imagine this. A massive generator just suddenly vanishes from the power grid. Sounds a bit like the start of a Hollywood disaster movie, right? But for grid operators, this is a very real, incredibly high-stakes battle against physics that happens literally in the blink of an eye. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going completely real-time to break down the dramatic split-second sequence of events that decides whether our modern world stays lit or plunges into total darkness.
So here is the ultimate test. In exactly 2 seconds, a major power station drops completely off the grid. Does the system collapse or does it recover? Posing that simple question really sets the stage for a massive race against time. We're going to run through a simulation of this exact event, looking at the invisible forces and automated defenses that kick in just milliseconds after a catastrophic failure.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's T-0. An inciting incident, maybe a massive lightning strike, or just a sudden mechanical failure, causes a huge generator to instantly trip offline. Now, the golden rule of the power grid is that supply and demand have to be perfectly matched at all times. But right now, they're absolutely not. We have a massive power vacuum on our hands. Consumer demand hasn't changed at all, but our supply just fell off a cliff. The clock is officially ticking.
To picture what happens next, it really helps to use an analogy, sort of like the one practical engineering uses. Imagine the power grid as a massive, heavy train. The speed that our train is traveling at, that represents the grid's frequency, usually exactly 50 or 60 hertz, depending on where you live. Every single locomotive pushing this train represents our generators, and every appliance drawing power is part of the train's load. They all have to travel at the exact same speed in perfect synchrony. And the physical weight or mass of this entire train, that is what we call inertia. So what happens if one of our locomotives suddenly dies? Well, the train instantly starts slowing down because the remaining engines now have to carry the exact same load all by themselves. On the grid, this means our frequency plunges. The speed of that plunge is tracked by a pretty terrifying metric known as ρf, or the rate of change of frequency. If that rate drops too fast, protective relays are going to trip, triggering a chain reaction of disconnections before human operators can even react.
Now, what's really interesting about the slide is how the grid buys itself those first few crucial seconds. It all comes down to the physical mass of the massive, heavy turbines inside conventional power plants. Because they're already physically spinning, they hold rotational kinetic energy. The exact millisecond our generator vanished, this spinning mass passively extracted its stored energy and injected it straight into the grid. It acts exactly like a giant shock absorber.
Instantly, the remaining online generators are forced to pitch in. In our scenario, each remaining generator might have to immediately cough up, say, 34 megawatts of extra power, pulling directly from its own stored kinetic energy to bridge that massive gap. And here's the crazy part. There are no sensors or digital commands doing this. Because they're giving up this energy, the turbines physically slow down, meaning the overall grid frequency drops. But that sacrifice actually slows the rate of the drop, buying the grid absolute lifesavers, time.
This creates a fascinating multi-scale timeline of defenses. The grid doesn't just rely on one safety net, it has a whole defense-in-depth hierarchy. From 0 to 2 seconds, we're relying entirely on that immediate physics, the passive inertial response we just discussed. Then, between 2 and 10 seconds, primary control kicks in. Fast forward to 30 seconds up to 15 minutes, and secondary control takes over. Finally, for anything beyond 15 minutes, we're into tertiary control. It's basically a high-stakes relay race from raw physics to eventual human intervention.
Let's zoom in on that critical 2 to 10 second window for a moment. This is where primary frequency response, or PFR, springs into action. The mechanical systems inside the remaining power plants detect that the frequency is falling. Automatically, the governors on these generators open their valves wider. They inject more steam or fluid to physically speed the turbines back up and increase the mechanical power output. This is the grid actively trying to arrest the fall.
But guys, the margins of error here are absolutely razor thin. If your grid is supposed to operate at 50 Hz, a drop to just 49.1 Hz is cause for major alarm. The dial barely has to twitch before emergency states are triggered across the board. It just goes to show how incredibly sensitive and tightly balanced the entire system really is.
To truly grasp these stakes, we need to look at a real-world climax. August 9, 2019, a lightning strike in the UK kicked off a catastrophic chain of events. In practically simultaneous succession, the grid lost the massive Hornsey offshore wind farm, the Little Barford gas plant, and hundreds of megawatts of smaller generators. We're talking a sudden loss of around 2,100 megawatts. The grid was literally bleeding power, and the frequency violently plummeted.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what that looks like. If you follow that plunging blue line on the graph, you are tracing the grid's frequency taking an absolute nosedive right after the lightning strike. Even though the initial reserves kicked in and briefly paused the fall at 49.1 Hz, another trip at the gas plant sent the frequency plunging all over again, all the way down to its lowest point, a terrifying nadir of 48.8 Hz.
So what happens when those primary controls completely fail? The grid is forced to make a really harsh sacrifice. We call this Underfrequency Load Shedding, or UFLS. It is the absolute ultimate safety net. UFLS automatically and intentionally disconnects portions of consumer demand. Yep, that means turning off entire neighborhoods and districts to artificially rebalance the equation. I know it sounds extreme, but it is literally the only way to save the whole system from a nationwide, cascading failure.
In that UK event, hitting exactly 48.8 Hz was the trigger. Breaching that number immediately activated their low-frequency demand disconnection scheme. It was a brief, highly controlled blackout that slashed demand fast enough to successfully prevent a total grid collapse. The harsh sacrifice actually worked, and the plunge was finally stopped.
Once the fall is finally arrested, the falling action begins. We enter the recovery phase to restore the balance. After about 30 seconds, secondary control steps in. Central computers calculate the error and fire off digital signals to specific generators to pump out more power, guiding the grid's heartbeat back to that nominal 50 or 60 Hz. Over the next few minutes to hours, tertiary control lets human operators manually dispatch slower, more economical reserves to fully reset the system. For context, in the UK, they had things stabilized in about 45 minutes.
So the crucial point is this. Our grid is fundamentally changing, which introduces a modern dilemma. Wind and solar power are inverter-based. They connect to the grid through power electronics, not massive spinning chunks of steel. Because of that, they do not naturally provide that critical, heavy physical inertia that has always acted as our grid's shock absorber.
When you compare the two, the conventional grid relied heavily on those massive turbines. High physical inertia meant we actually had time to react. But our modern system, dominated by renewables, has very low inertia. That means our rate of change, our roll-off, is so much faster. The frequency can fall so incredibly fast that it might just bypass early safety nets entirely. Which brings us to a really critical crossroads. Transitioning to clean energy is absolutely essential, but it removes the very physics that have kept our power network stable for a century. As we lose that physical inertia to inverter-based renewables, how exactly will the grid survive the ticking clock when the next massive generator suddenly vanishes? Engineers are already working on brilliant solutions to engineer virtual inertia for tomorrow's networks. But one thing is for sure. The race to re-engineer the heartbeat of our modern world has only just begun. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it sparked your curiosity about the invisible forces powering our lives.